It is Monday, January the 14th, 2019. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast. I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, private prisons and the money of misery. So right today, we're going to take a overall look starting in the 1980s of how the private prison industry in the United States and then indeed the worldwide market for profiting from the incarceration of human beings who definitely deserve better. That will be our task today. But of course, before I get to all of that, of course, a brief reminder that today's show, as every show, is brought to you by listeners like you, listeners who go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. Support one unimportant guy's quest to speak into a microphone about things he has taken the time to learn a little bit about. As small a feat as that seems, maybe, to you, I feel like there's a lot of people who don't do that. Learn things, people. You talk to a microphone and have something to say. Anyway, not to get too meta on you. Patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. Go there, support my work, support my research, support my writing. It's been a little bit since I've posted an episode. I'm a little bit behind, but I have been up to a lot. Yesterday I had a little debate, quote unquote, with one James Reefer Cake, I believe. It's his legal name. You may remember him from the Majority Report. You may have never heard of him. He's a big Tulsi Gabbard fan. The news this week, Tulsi Gabbard, of course, is announced for president, and I went over a few of the more glaring reasons why, if you're a lefty or a socialist or anything like that, you should probably look a little bit sideways at her at the very least. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, I'm not going to push it through the podcast feed. There will be a link at dissidentpeasant.com, which is always headquarters for now and forever. I've also started a movement, hashtag gotta jump. You may have seen that video floating around. I will also link that at dissidentpeasant.com. Probably throw that up on the Patreon too. Finally, the survey that I had you all take, I want to just thank you all for your responses. I really appreciated it. Your feedback has already got me thinking. Speaking of which, you can look forward to this Friday. I'm going to have a guest on. I'm back on Tim's Darwin, or Tim's Darwin, whichever you prefer. I actually prefer Tim's, but I may call him by his real name if he'll let me. He is, of course, a professor and academic in Pennsylvania. So he actually knows a little bit of what he speaks of. I'll have a conversation with him about the news, and maybe a little bit of history on top of that. You look for that on Friday or Saturday, thereabouts. That, of course, will be pushed out through the regular podcast feed. All right, that is enough meta self-promotion. Let's go on to the show. So I want to read a brief section. It's from a marketing blurb under the header, quote, "A brand new industry sparked by one bright idea," end quote, from the CoreCivic website. Used to be known as Corrections Corporation of America. Quote, "Founded as Corrections Corporation of America, this new startup in the early 1980s changed the landscape of corrections in the United States. CCA could design, finance, build, operate, and manage correctional facilities of many types in direct partnership with government agencies. The company could also tailor correctional solutions based on correctional agencies' precise needs, with budget, population, classification, policies, and procedures in mind. The promise of public-private partnership in corrections was planted when CCA secured its first ever contract with the U.S. Department of Justice for an Immigration and Naturalization Services. for the development and operation of a Houston processing center, end quote. Even cotton candy doesn't taste as sweet as all of that, and this particular heap of spun sugar conceals a poisoned core. For in many ways, that 1983 contract was really a turning point. Now, shamefully, in the American past, there have been times where we put people into cages, large ones, small ones, nonetheless, boxes of confinement, simply for being of a different race or speaking a different language, etc. But the idea that we as a society, would allow private capital to operate and speculate on such a market is a bit newer. I don't want to be a material reductionist about the many forces that must come together to propagate, say, a policy of criminalizing asylum seeking or perpetuating a generally arbitrary, cruel, inefficient system for adjudicating immigration cases in the United States or larger issues of criminal justice at the federal and state level, etc., etc. But I am personally convinced that allowing a market in such human misery has done a fair share of contributing to our current problems. So let's go back to 1983. Try to trace a bit of the history that led us to the sorry state we occupy at present. So to set the scene a bit for you, because life needs a bit of spice, it's the year of Michael Jackson's Moonwalk and Thriller. The year the first object ever made by human hands left our solar system. The year McDonald's introduced the McNugget. Of course, the year of Reagan. With an exhortation to, quote, make America great again, end quote, Reagan had campaigned in the 1980 election to destroy the very bureaucracy he sought to lead, or get government out of the way, as he might put it. In any case, some very American businessmen had a great idea to form a new company called the Corrections Corporation of America, today the largest private prison company in the United States, and thus the world, naturally, since rebranded to CoreCivic. One of those guys was a guy named Thomas Beasley, a former chair of the Tennessee Republican Party, who saw how the privatization of healthcare facilities in the 80s had been incredibly profitable. Quote, CCA will be to jails and prisons that are owned and managed by local, state, and federal governments what Hospital Corporation of America has become to medical facilities nationwide, end quote. Their innovation was not so innovative, of course. Jails in England during the Middle Ages were operated by private parties at a profit. Colonial America's jails were run for profit by private interests as well. Now, these jails were usually for sentences of short duration or for holding a prisoner while he awaits trial. In the 19th century, prisons more recognizable to us began to appear. Much more often, confinement itself became the society-sanctioned punishment for souls in need of penance. This is where the word penitentiary comes from. Now, these institutions were usually public, but private interests did take great advantage of convict leasing programs, for example, that would save them enormous money on labor costs. In fact, as a man living in the South, I would be remiss not to remark that this system was and is particularly popular in the states of the former Confederacy. And it is through this system that huge swaths of black people are more or less re-enslaved. Civil War and Reconstruction be damned. Anyway, don't want to get too sidetracked. So we got Beasley, the Tennessee GOP hack. There's also a former warden and prison boss named Terrell Don Hutton, and a real estate C-suite executive. They all joined forces with a venture capitalist who had helped build Kentucky Fried Chicken to create their little company, CCA, go into the age-old business of selling a product to a single customer, Uncle Sam. According to Beasley, the idea was to sell prisons, quote, just like you were selling cars, or real estate, or hamburgers, end quote. And if marketing was in fashion, so were prisons and tough-on-crime politicians in the 80s. The U.S. prisoner population would rise an astounding 500% since CCA was founded in 1983. Their small team then had the innovative business sense to locate and lease an old motel in Houston, Texas for that contract they received. So, truly tasks only capable of performance by the private sector. how could any other force other than the free market ever figure out anything as complicated as buying, leasing, or building a structure to house people in? Anyway, CCA, off and running, began winning contracts here and there at the county level. And for INS, that's the Immigration and Naturalization Service, since reorganized in 2003, so no longer a thing. And also for juvenile detention centers. But problems at these facilities began almost immediately. Now, hopefully you can imagine the basic problem that will vex them the entire episode, but if you are paid a fixed sum for the housing, food, amenities, and services for a population of humans who cannot leave and that you have to take care of and are confined, then the most basic way to envision profit is to spend as little as possible on those inmates and take the difference. Now, these contracts are obviously a little bit more complicated than that. For example, frequently minimum occupancy guarantees are written into these agreements with the local, state, or federal government, where the company might get paid per head, but also get paid like 96% of their capacity in any case. But the basic idea that you spend less on prisoners to make more is true, and that's exactly what began to happen. Now, lawsuits began inevitably, of course. Nearly half of all of them were either about injuries in the prison, inadequate medical care, or inhumane conditions that violated civil rights of prisoners, at least between 1998 and 2010. And I imagine that many of the suits in the earlier 80s and 90s were similar. Suits that were actually made much harder to file by the Prison Litigation Reform Act of 1996, by the way. So thanks to Clinton and the GOP for that. Anyway, CCA rode high for a while. But after topping out at around $150 a share in 1998, by 2000, you could get a share for less than 19 cents at one point. What's astonishing is that after cratering so hard and failing so spectacularly nearly 20 years ago at this point, to the point where the CEO was leaving the company in disgrace and they were paying out hundreds of millions of dollars to settle lawsuits, that CCA would bounce back so incredibly. All the while continuing to improve basically not at all in their management of detention centers from any point of view that isn't rank sadism. So, what do I mean exactly? Well, this can't be comprehensive, obviously, but the first big lawsuit was in 1988. It was for inadequate medical care resulting in a prisoner's death. CCA settled that for $100,000 and moved on. In 88 and 89, a series of prisoner escapes took place in a Florida jail they ran. In 1990, a riot erupted in their Tennessee prison less than a year after its opening. In 1993, they were hit with another serious lawsuit, resulting from the deaths of 3 prisoners in a shooting at a New Mexico jail they ran. All in all, some people thought this business was not long for the world. But they were wrong. So, by 1995, you remember that 500% increase in prison population from 1983 that I mentioned? Well, by 1995, the prison population had about tripled since I began my story, and governments at all levels were struggling to keep up. Most of them stuck to public sector solutions, but many could not resist the urge to follow the siren song industry officials sang to them of budget surpluses and economic activity in their communities. In fact, CCA itself began building prisons entirely upon speculation with borrowed money and preparation for some contracts for prisoners that would never come. And this was part of the reason they were in such trouble by 2001. Liabilities related to this real estate, in addition to the lawsuits. The industry did receive a boost when the Clinton administration allowed the Federal Bureau of Prisons to begin contracting out all this stuff. And this is how CCA branched out at the federal level from immigrant detention alone. Anyway, by August 1999, as an example, CCA officials arrived in Tulsa, Oklahoma to visit for the first time and run their brand new spanking jail. 1 month later, they accidentally released their first inmate, who was allowed to post bond when they shouldn't have. Over the next couple years, dozens of inmates would actually escape this facility by impersonating other prisoners or lying about matters of consequence on their court documents, which none of the CCA employees had been trained to read, and other ways. And believe it or not, even worse disasters were to come. especially for CCA's competitors in the business of warehousing human beings. Because attention was focused on these competitors for a time, CCA mostly sailed beneath the radar in the 90s. This began to turn around 97, when a prison in Youngstown, Ohio, operated by CCA, began to simmer and then boil over. From the moment it opened in May 97, stabbings of prisoners began. Attorneys sued, alleging the prison was unsafe and inhuman. By the time a judge got around to issuing the decision in February 98, there had already been 19 stabbings in less than a year. Things went from bad to worse that July when 6 prisoners, 4 of whom were convicted murderers, cut a gate open in broad daylight and escaped. The mayor of Youngstown, Ohio, among those who had believed the honeyed words of CCA officials about economic activity and security, and among those who had watched the prison built on the town's free land with huge tax abatements devolve into a poorly run operation with poorly paid employees, called the whole thing a nightmare. By March of 99, CCA was paying out $1.6 million to prisoners in Youngstown, $750,000 in legal fees, as well as agreeing to independent monitoring of their facilities. That prison actually closed in July of 2001, taking with it jobs that had paid a pittance but paid nonetheless, and leaving behind an empty complex of ghostly buildings. So, because of shit like this, by the early aughts, it looked like it might be the end of CCA, which is why their stock was so cheap, maybe even the entire private prison industry. But in addition to the debacles I've told you about, and there are plenty more of them, I assure you, something else emerged in the press around the same time that really should have settled the debate over whether or not any of this is a good idea. I hope that you, like me, are also inclined by disposition and wisdom to recognize that it is the height of folly and idiocy to make laws that lock up huge amounts of people and then allow the shoulders of capital to bear the burden of housing and feeding those people at a profit. But if not, then Charles Thomas, a real-life academic-type professor from the University of Florida, had been a reliable voice in the media for CCA and its competitors in the market. He was frequently quoted in news pieces as a balance against pesky liberals and lefties who wanted to put a stop to all this. And he also wrote and published industry-funded studies that supposedly supported their conclusions that private prisons were awesome. Thomas was named to the board of CCA's real estate trust eventually, and by 1999 was getting fined $20,000 by the State Ethics Commission for not disclosing the tidy $3 million CCA had been paying him to be an advisor. Cast a huge amount of doubt on his scholarship, frequently cited in the media, about the efficiency of the private prison industry. But of course, around this low point, you know and I know that private prisons and the CCA were not about to disappear from this world. You know, like any good corporate entity under this kind of fire, they made a big show of firing some bigwigs like the CEO I talked to you about and developing messaging that softened their image, as well as claiming to have reformed in their operations. But fundamentally, they pretty much remain the same, with the same problems of cost, safety, and human rights continuing at their prisons. Other than benefiting from the criminalization of huge swaths of people by our nation's laws, how did CCA bounce back from all this? Well, basically in two ways. The first, a sort of effective, kind of common system of good old-fashioned American political corruption, and a second, cold-blooded encouragement of that same criminalization of people. Now, to describe the first, I mean kind of a combination of political contributions and what you might have heard described of as honest graft. That is, using public contracts and jobs to accumulate personal wealth and access to the public sector. This is stuff like the semi-famous revolving door, right, that separates public and private employees at the highest levels in the United States. Government officials who take jobs in the private sector that once lobbied them for contracts. As a few examples, top aides to the governor of Tennessee and that state's former commissioner of human services both took jobs at CCA in the early aughts. giving the company reliable voices to put out there whenever their prisons rioted or whatever. Now, such activities are somewhat common in other industries like energy companies, telecoms, financial institutions. They all do this shit, among others. What made CCA and its ilk a little more unique in their evil was and is their tendency to lobby for laws that guarantee longer prison sentences and more of them as the easiest way to guarantee that their prisons remain full and that they get paid. I'm just going to quote a little bit from a 2003 report by prisonpolicy.org. Quote, at the 2002 trade show sponsored by the American Correctional Association in Philadelphia, CCA Vice President Louise Green told National Public Radio that belonging to ALEC, that's the American Legislative Exchange Council, gives the company a chance to educate state lawmakers. At the show, NPR reported Wisconsin State Representative Scott Walker proudly declared that he was part of a group of lawmakers that had helped pass the state's, quote, truth in sentencing, end quote, legislation, which was similar to a model bill prepared by ALEC. NPR noted that, quote, the Wisconsin Department of Corrections says the truth in sentencing law will add to the state's prison population in the years to come. That's money in the bank for Corrections Corporation of America, end quote. A former head of Wisconsin's prison system, Walter Dickey, told NPR that it was shocking that lawmakers would write sentencing policy with help from ALEC. But James Ball, Vice President of Customer Relations for CCA, told NPR that the company did not advocate for longer sentences. He also claimed that ALEC is merely a research organization, not a promoter of public policy. A different impression was given by Harold Brubaker, a member of ALEC and a state legislature in North Carolina. When he was interviewed on a BBC radio program on private prisons in April 2003, the interviewer asked whether, quote, there may be some vested interest in companies like Wackenhut and CCA pushing for harder, tougher legislation, end quote. Brubaker responded, quote, absolutely, yes. I can visualize the point, end quote. For the record, CCA did sever ties officially with ALEC in 2010. Now, for all this obvious corruption and also just not being very good at running prisons, it still kept getting hired over and over and over again. Other than its persistent marketing and image cultivation and that's literally throwing money around, CCA also benefited from a big change in federal law, specifically immigration law. The Clinton-signed Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996 was long and complicated as federal law tends to be. But one major impact of that law was the expansion of the number of offenses an undocumented immigrant could commit and then be vulnerable to deportation proceedings. In other words, Uncle Sam was about to round up huge numbers of people for non-violent offenses and house them in confinement, with no plan to build the infrastructure to do so himself. Makes it pretty inevitable that contracting out such activity would become the norm, and indeed that's exactly what happened, even as CCA and its rivals racked up failure after failure. Now, despite the fact that counties, cities, and even the feds continued to do business with CCA, neither they nor any of their competitors in the market could ever get an entire state prison into their grasping hands until late in 2011, when after years of this lobbying and cajoling and marketing and cultivating their image, they bought the Lake Erie Correctional Institution for $72.3 million. In a groundbreaking move that would pave the way for other states to cut the costs of operating their prisons. So it was said. Problems, of course, began immediately. Triple bunking became a norm, and cells barely big enough for 2, let alone 3. The head maintenance guy quit a few months in, frustrated by a chronic lack of resources to keep everything running. As spring began to stir beneath the sky of Ohio, employees at the prison remarked that the dorms would be getting very hot soon in the summer. Their superiors told them to turn on the air conditioning, which the dorms literally didn't have. Imagine spending close to $73 million for a building and not knowing whether it has air conditioning. A year into operation, audits found widespread violence, mismanagement, severe lack of medical treatment. Prisoners were forced to defecate into plastic bags for lack of working toilets. Calls to the city police from the prison increased exponentially. All adult education programs were scrapped. CCA was fined a cool $500,000 for all this. and things did get a bit better there. They still operate that prison to this day, in a manner not too different from a prison in the 18th century. If you were locked up but a person of means, then, depending on your offense in the prison, you could actually live something close to, if not a decent, then a humane life. With okay food, accommodations, visitors, things to do and shit. But then as now, all of that took money. The more money you have access to, the better your access to small luxuries, better food, communication with the outside world, even toiletries, etc. And what is old is new again. Now we've long since crossed over the threshold that separates history and modern affairs, and I could continue on, detailing all kinds of abuses at privately run prisons, including bets on fights, rampant sexual assault of female prisoners, CCA's active interest and work in keeping marijuana criminalized, and encouraging the detaining of ever more undocumented people in the United States, including children. I won't go on about that anymore, but this remains a going and growing concern, particularly under a Republican government as now, but not only then. In 2016, Hillary Clinton was criticized for accepting bundled contributions from former lobbyists for the CCA, since rebranded as CoreCivic, like I said, and Geo Group, the other big holder of market share in private prisons. Upon the election of Donald Trump, stock in those two companies more than and nearly doubled in value, respectively, as investors salivated over the prospect of yet more guaranteed revenue streams, though their prices have mostly fallen in rocky fashion since. As of this writing, they generally remain on the upswing, for whatever that's worth. These companies also spread their tendrils overseas, notably to the UK and Australia. Australia, in particular, has its own mirror history almost to this Yankee version of events I've told you about, of corrupt and inhumane detention centers operated by CoreCivic and others, particularly with regards to refugees and ethnic minorities in and around that country. So after laying all this out, I feel a little bit sheepish in my overall conclusion, which feels a little bit second order, but I'll present it nonetheless. What's the point if I don't, right? Anyway, with the law in the United States, we have it the way it's currently applied, requiring the public sector to both manage that law and manage the punishments of those who violate the law, of course, would be better than what we have. For example, there's some small hope, at least, that the costs associated with mass incarceration, when borne by the public, will make it easier to abandon oft-repeated tough-on-crime rhetoric of Democrat and Republican alike, currently made all the easier when there's a great deal of money sloshing around into making that rhetoric a reality. But better still would be to imagine a world where, say, drugs are decriminalized, where to apply for refugee status is not treated as an act of aggression, or where the primary purpose of confinement, apart from society at large, is to separate people from those comparatively few who are actually incapable of wider integration, rather than considering confinement a punishment itself for a whole slew of offenses. These are not really revolutionary ideas, except in reactionary America. We could also not allow a profit in prisoners or their labor at all, in any sphere, either public or private. Such ideas are dangerous to the entities I've talked about, like CoreCivic and Geo Group. And they have admitted as much, though we only know so through leaks, not through open disclosure. There is nothing so confining as the prisons of our perceptions, said some dude centuries ago. Easy enough to say, you might think, when human life is so much cheaper now, and that we wring the money out of humans as prisoners and suffer no danger of labor shortage, and have industrialized the confinement of people in addition to financializing it. I tend to think that old dude has a point, though, and that the confinement of people follows from the confinement of our perceptions. I am no one important in the vast scheme of things, and neither are you, probably. But I hope that we both, after this episode, have something our supposed betters do not: vision beyond perception. Because before we can build a world less brutal than our own, we must first build it in our minds. Okay, thanks for joining me. I hope you like that. Just because I'm going to start doing weekly interviews on the news and stuff doesn't mean you can't look forward to more structured things like what you just listened to, which I hope you enjoyed. Maybe you can get Ronald Reagan. Come talk about some of this on the show in the future. We will see. But in the meantime, see you later.